Welcome to another lesson in genetics. And in this lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about genotype. Now, genotype is the actual genes that make up the individual. And it can be very complicated because humans, for example, have between 30,000 and 40,000 genes, and every single one of those genes and their copies on the other chromosomes will make up the full genotype of an individual. But when we talk about genetics, usually what we're talking about is just following one or two genes around the place. And so we can make the whole story a lot simpler by just looking at one or two genes. So in order to try and explain that, we'll have a look at the desk over here, and we'll show you this. So if we consider a gene, for example, and we'll just call this gene T. Now we only talk about one or two genes at a time, so we can use a letter for it. Obviously, with 30 or 40,000 genes in the human genome, we'll run out of letters pretty quickly. And of course, when we name them individually, they have more complex names. But we can represent it as a single letter for these purposes. So this gene lives in chromosome 1. So because chromosome 1, everybody in our population has 2 copies of chromosome 1, that means I have 2 copies of T. All right, so that's straightforward. Every individual has 2 copies of that gene. It's the same gene, except one lives on the first copy of chromosome 1 and one lives on the second copy of chromosome 1. Okay, so a diploid individual has 2 copies of T. Now we're going to call this big T or capital T. Big T is the traditional way of referring to it. So big T, capital T. Because there's another allele, remember, a version of a gene of T, and we're going to call it little t. Now little t is the same gene as T, except it's got some kind of mutation in it, which means it's not as functional as T. For example, T might make a long tail on a mouse, whereas little t, big T, might make a long tail, whereas little t might make a short tail. It might have a tendency for the tail to be not fully formed. Now, we'll see how that works in a little while. So, because I've written this as little t, because little t is what we call recessive. Now, there are various terms we want to remember on this. So we have to remember allele, and we talked about allele in the previous lesson, and diploid individuals. Now, little t is recessive. Its effect is only seen in the absence of big T. So if big T is there, then we'll get a long tail on our mouse. All right. So if I have an individual who's got one chromosome, and as long as big T is there on one chromosome, then I'll get a long-tailed mouse. But if I get a mouse where it's only got little t, so there's little t on the first copy of chromosome 1 and little t on the second copy of chromosome 1, then that mouse is going to have a short tail because it doesn't have a copy of big T. It's only got 2 copies of chromosome 1, and both copies have the recessive little t. So big T is what we call dominant. It always expresses as long as it is present. Little t is recessive. Okay, so we need to remember the term dominant as well. All right, so an individual in the population could be one of 3 possibilities. It could be big T, big T. Remember, 2 copies of chromosome 1. It's got a copy of the gene on each chromosome. And in this case, the first copy of chromosome 1 has a big T. The second copy of chromosome 1 has the identical big T. So it could also be big T, little t. So the first copy of chromosome 1 carries the big T version of the gene, and the second copy of chromosome 1 carries the little t version of the gene, the recessive version. Okay? And finally, we could have little t, little t. So both copies of chromosome 1 carry the little t gene. Now these are what we call genotypes. They are the actual genes that we're talking about. So we're only talking about 2 genes out of the, we're only talking about 1 gene out of all the 30,000 genes, say, in a mouse, 30 or 40,000 genes. We're only talking about 1 of those genes. And that gene has 2 different alleles. And in any individual can only have 2 copies. So it can have two copies of big T. It can have one copy of big T and one copy of little t, and two copies of little t. Now, when we have two the same, so big T, and little t, these are known as homozygous. Homozygous, basically homo means the same, and zygous means, as we've already noted, of the genes, or of the genes. So the same genes are on each of the two copies of chromosome 1. We also have the possibility of this, which is what we call heterozygous. So hetero means different of the genes. So the two copies of chromosome 1, one copy of chromosome 1 has a different version of the gene to the other copy of chromosome 1. I hope that's nice and clear. And what we're going to look at next is the effect of this, because obviously if you've got big T or big T little t, you might have different genotypes, but you're going to have the same length of tail. So that's an important distinction between genotype and the next thing we're going to talk about in our next lesson. And I'll leave you there.